Okay, so I think we'll get started. So welcome everybody to this webinar delivered by the UK's Nuclear Security Culture Programme. I'm Chris Hobbs, Professor in Science and International Security in the Department of War Studies at King's College London and co-director of the Centre for Science and Security Studies. It's my pleasure to be chairing this event this morning, which looks at nuclear security during times of crisis. Here we will be presenting the initial results of a research project that we've been running at King's in partnership with the Stimson Center. And I should say that when we talk about crisis in the context of this webinar, here we're really thinking about unforeseen events that require rapid decision-making and solutions and affect security, nuclear security at sort of national and organizational levels. Unsurprisingly, the motivation for this project comes in large part from the recent disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. So what you'll see presented here are historical cases, but we're trying to extrapolate lessons for the current situation. I should also say that we're not looking necessarily directly at security-related incidents when we talk about crises. Here we're instead looking at broader political, economic, and natural disasters and how they have triggered disruptions to nuclear security systems. And some of these have resulted in instances, but it's not the incident sort of per se that we're using as the motivator for this particular crisis. So before we get into our four different speakers, I just wanted to remind everyone that we're very keen to interact with you. So please do feel free to ask questions. There's a Q&A box that you should see if you're accessing Zoom via the web, via a browser. So do pop your questions in there. And then at the end of the presentations, I will summarize them and pose them to our panelists. I should also say that this webinar is being recorded, so we plan on making it available on our YouTube channel. So if for any reason you have to duck out early, you'll be able to see the full recording there. And with that, I now just want to turn to introducing our four speakers. So first up, we're going to have Nick Roth, who's Director of the Nuclear Security Program at the Stimson Center. We're then going to have Dr. Sarah Tzinieris, who's a research fellow with us here at King's College London. And then Dr. Geoff Chapman, who's a research associate with us here at King's College London. And then finally, Amelie Stoetzel, who's a research assistant here with us at King's College London. And each of the speakers, they've been working on particular cases, and they're going to talk about some of the findings from the work that they've been putting together. And I should also note that the full findings, we're looking to publish this as a CSSS occasional paper series, and that should hopefully be available in the next 2 to 3 weeks from our website. So do check back on that. We'll also be sending it out to anyone that has participated in this webinar. Okay, and without further ado, I'm going to turn to our first speaker, which is Nick. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with the other researchers who've been working on this project. The title of my talk is Nuclear Security in a Time of Crisis, Cerro Grande Fire. And this case is particularly interesting to me because it shows some of the major challenges that come from catastrophes like wildfires, and how those challenges impact nuclear facilities, and how nuclear facilities can adapt during times of crisis. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about why I wanted to look at a case study with wildfires. Maintaining security in mid-wildfires has become a growing challenge for nuclear facilities around the world. Here are just a few examples of some major wildfires that have occurred. Obviously, there's the Cerro Grande fire that I'm going to be talking about. But then in 2010, there was a wildfire near the Cerro nuclear facility in Russia, where explosives materials were removed from the facility out of concern over the fire. In 2019, a wildfire burning 456 square kilometers forced the evacuation of Idaho National Laboratory in the United States. In 2020, a forest fire in northern Ukraine came within a few kilometers of a waste storage site near Chernobyl. And over the next few decades, I think it's very likely that climate change is going to exacerbate the severity of these fires, potentially posing greater risks to nuclear facilities. And I should mention also the Woolsey fire in California, one of the major fires that occurred in 2019 in California, actually started at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. Next slide. So just to give some background on the Cerro Grande fire, it's one of the most important and most extensively studied examples of wildfires threatening a nuclear facility. At the time, it was the largest fire in New Mexico's history. Other fires have since surpassed the size of the Cerro Grande, but it burned approximately 75 square miles of land in 16 days. The fire burned about a quarter of the 43 square mile area of Los Alamos National Laboratory. It caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage to the facility, destroying research, equipment, structures, and it forced the shutdown of the facility for several days. None of the 5 locations where nuclear weapons usable material were stored at the time at LANL were destroyed, but catastrophe may have only been narrowly averted. There was heavy damage to areas around nuclear storage facilities. The fire burned close to the plutonium facility at Technical Area 55, and its supporting buildings and damaged land near the critical assembly facility at TA-18. It took 2 weeks for the material balance areas to resume normal material control and accounting operations. And one quote that I found as I was going through the research that really stood out to me from an official at LANL was, "No one knew the status of the nuclear materials held at LANL after the crisis." Next slide. So there are multiple lessons learned from this incident. And the first one I want to focus on is emergency planning. Prior to the crisis, there had been no comprehensive assessment of how a site-wide emergency and evacuation would impact operations, the facilities, infrastructure systems, or contingency plans. The Emergency Operations Center wasn't equipped to respond to an extended site-wide emergency of this kind. And in many cases, it was relying on insufficient, unavailable, or outdated information. And some of the analysis of the recovery process after the immediate emergency found that there was no office or individual at LANL or DOE with whom facility managers could discuss the damage assessments or prioritize project requests. So what are some of the lessons learned from emergency planning? The first is ensuring that there is a comprehensive institutional and emergency recovery plan in place that's before the emergency occurs. The second is to ensure that there are systems to maintain access to critical security information during the crisis. And I think in many ways, this issue, it might be easier today than it was 20 years ago when the fire, resolving this might be easier than it was 20 years ago when the fire occurred. And then finally, establishing an institutional list of essential facilities that need to be prioritized during emergencies and in recovery operations, knowing which facilities are the most important ones, which ones that from both a security perspective, but also in ramping back up activities. Next slide. So communications is another important area of nuclear security during a crisis. This communications obviously impacts all operations at a nuclear facility, including those related to security systems. So one of the central aspects of the chaos and confusion faced by LANL leadership and emergency responders was a lack of communications from managers to employees and to contractors during the crisis. LANL didn't have a centralized list or method of tracking employees during the evacuation. This meant that employees relied on different sources of information, causing some to attempt to return to work prematurely. Others didn't know whether their facilities are shut down. And simple things like even a phone tree didn't exist where employees could relay information to each other. One notable success story, sort of through the event, was something called the Geographic Information System. This was sort of an ad hoc activity that some LANL employees started engaging in throughout the emergency, where GIS staff joined with external volunteers to provide local first responders with detailed mapping of LANL and nuclear materials storage sites, where if the fire approached, it could have been catastrophic. There were these sort of ad hoc efforts to provide real-time data about the emergency that was happening. And then finally, just noting that when communications were established, like I just described, it was done in an ad hoc manner. For employees providing emergency field support, communications and control centers were established as they were needed, utilizing whatever types of communication devices that were available and in working order. So what are some of the lessons about communications during this crisis? The first is that it's essential that to share real-time site-specific information and to make sure security officials have access to that information. Number two, it's also essential to ensure that there is a system for maintaining access to critical security data. And then finally, the lines of authority and communication must be well understood prior to the crisis. Next slide. So there are a number of lessons during the crisis related to security culture. The fire really compounded existing security problems. And I think this is a reoccurring lesson from these emergencies, that when they occur, they exacerbate whatever existing problems might exist within a nuclear facility. The Cerro Grande fire occurred at a time where LANL was addressing really long-standing systemic security problems. It had a history of poor, unsatisfactory security ratings, and was just beginning to address some major problems related to those unsatisfactory ratings. But during the emergency, facility and emergency response staff who had to continue reporting to work found it really difficult to enter the gate to the facility. Access control became a major issue. Gates and badge readers needed to be manually overridden to allow first responders into the facility. This took time, and it was unclear what the access and reentry requirements were for the site during emergencies because there was no authority in charge of the process. Apparently, access control to LANL during emergencies has been a reoccurring issue since. There was just a report published on this topic. Finally, the Cerro Grande case demonstrates the importance of regular and realistic training for security personnel. It's possible that if perhaps such a program existed at the time that incorporated this type of scenario, the response to the crisis might have been better. So what are some of the lessons? One, it's essential that the organizational security culture include the idea that security needs to be maintained even during crises like this. Two, that security procedures should be established and understood for facility entry and reentry, especially during times of crisis. And then also that regular and realistic training for security personnel and an adaptable training regime will help to bolster organizations' resilience during these emergencies. And in conclusion, while no security incident occurred during the fire, the whole story does raise questions in my mind, at least, as to whether there was material at risk during the emergency. And hopefully this not only serves as a cautionary tale, but also provides examples for how nuclear facilities can adapt when such emergencies occur. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Nick. And again, if you have any questions for Nick, if you just pop them in the Q&A box on Zoom, and then we'll ask those to him at the end. So moving on from Cerro Grande to Fukushima and passing over to Sarah.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome, everybody. So my case study is looking at the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plants in Japan. Next slide. So in this short presentation, I'm going to start off just running through the timeline of the disaster, and then I'm going to talk about the human factors behind the crisis. So primarily, the Fukushima disaster was a safety incident, not a security incident. although due to many of the kind of human factors behind the crisis, there were a number of security failings as well. So the earthquake occurred on in March 2011, and it was absolutely unprecedented. There was a huge earthquake, 9 on the Richter scale, followed by a tsunami 40 minutes later that in places was up to 40 meters high, and it absolutely devastated the northeast coast of Japan. And this resulted in the nuclear incident at the Fukushima Daiichi plant, and it was classified on the International Nuclear Event Scale as 7, making it the second most serious event in history. So after Chernobyl, the most serious nuclear incident in history. So some of the key human factors behind the crisis relate to the role of communications, the role of leadership, and the role of governance and the regulatory system. So I'm just, after I've gone through the disaster itself, I'm just going to talk about those in more detail. Like I said, although this is primarily a safety incident, there's many learnings for security that are really interesting to extrapolate from the crisis. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you a visualization of the scale of the devastation. In the middle of the slide, you'll see a map which shows the epicenter of the earthquake, and then the four of Japan's nuclear power plants, which are located along that coastline. And interestingly, Fukushima Daiichi wasn't actually the closest located plant to the epicenter of the earthquake. And although all of those different nuclear facilities suffered severe damage, the crisis unfolded at Fukushima Daiichi primarily because of human factors. So which really kind of emphasizes how important organizational culture and security culture are in firstly allowing a crisis to develop, and also the crisis management response. On the bottom left, you'll see a photo of just complete devastation along the coastline. Top left is one of the reactors at the Fukushima plant, which was the most severely damaged. There's four reactors at the plant, and 3 of those were in operation at the time. Bottom right is the seawater coming in. What happened with the tsunami was that all the water came in, and then it actually flooded the whole of the ground floor levels, and then some of the basement levels. Okay, next slide, please. So the earthquake struck in the afternoon of the 11th of March. It was 9 on the international Richter scale. So quite an unprecedented event, although saying that Japan had suffered huge earthquakes over the years. So actually the majority of the damage to that part of Japan was from the tsunami, not from the earthquake, because most buildings, including the nuclear facilities, were built to withstand severe earthquakes. But following the earthquake, there was this huge tsunami, and the whole of that coastline was flooded, and up to around 20,000 people died. And then around the area of the plant, and you can look at Fukushima Daiichi, but not just that, but mainly that area. Around 100,000 people were evacuated, and very sadly, the majority of those never returned to the region. So what happened at Fukushima was, you'll see on the bottom right of this hand side of the slide, a diagram, and on the left side there's a seawall, and although the seawall was using the design basis threat, was built in theory to withstand a tsunami. It wasn't built high enough. It had been enlarged a few years before, but it was not high enough for this tsunami, and mainly that was because the threat wasn't really recognised. There had been some modelling work done in the nuclear agency, but although for a number of reasons, the seawall had never been enlarged, and so when this huge tsunami occurred, it just went straight over the seawall, flooded into the reactor buildings at Fukushima Daiichi. And then on the right hand side, you'll see emergency diesel generator. And so the water actually flooded these diesel generators. And that's what really led to the nuclear incident. So after the earthquake occurred, all the nuclear reactors along, not just Fukushima Daiichi, but all over Japan, where the earthquake had struck, they were actually shut down through automated systems. So at that stage, there wasn't much damage. But the emergency on-site generator started operating, and once the tsunami happened, because of in the Daiichi plant, because of the location of these diesel generators, the water flooded the areas, and they weren't able to operate anymore. So that resulted ultimately in a partial nuclear meltdown of the reactors. The heat exchangers were transferring, the reactor waste were damaged, and the reactors were unable to maintain their cooling and water circulation and functionality. There was a number of hydrogen explosions, there were some fires, and there was this massive release of volatile radioisotopes into the atmosphere. And it was the release of the radiation actually that led to the classification of 7, making it the second most serious nuclear incident in history. And today, there's still clear-up operation at the plant, and the full decommissioning period is predicted to take about 30 to 40 years. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so during the crisis phase, it was very much a safety incident. There was really very little focus on nuclear security. There were hundreds of different workers onto the site, including workers from TEPCO, so that's the operator of the plant. There was contractors there, firefighters, military, etc. Their primary goal was to avert a nuclear meltdown. They were focusing on the cooling systems, restoring the power supply, and replenishing the spent fuel ponds that had overheated. And actually, in some ways, they were quite successful in preventing further releases of radiation. However, there were a lot of issues with people coming and going on the site. There was very, very little monitoring of them. So from a nuclear security point of view, this was not a very secure environment. And that goes back to what Nick was talking about, the constraints of nuclear security and safety. In a crisis situation, they both need to be kind of worked through together. And even if your site is undergoing a serious safety incident, you still need to be thinking about the security implications of that, particularly in terms of personnel being on the site. Because of the strength of the earthquake in that part of Japan, the communications across the region were really severely damaged. Transport links were down, roads were closed, places were just unable to reach. And what this meant was the senior leadership team at TEPCO, so that's the operator, they were actually unable to travel to the headquarters and also to the nuclear plant. There was an off-site emergency operations center, and that was damaged from the earthquake. So there was a real difficulty for the leadership at TEPCO to take control of the situation. There was very poor communications. It wasn't very clear like where the locus of command was coming from, and ultimately the Prime Minister's office stepped in to oversee the crisis management response. They set up a joint TEPCO government unit within the company just to manage this, and that created some successes, but there was also a lot of tensions between the operator, the government, and the regulator. Top left is just to show you where where the people were evacuated from. So going back to my previous point about 100,000 people being evacuated primarily from not just from that area, but primarily from that area because of the incident at Daiichi, and many of those people never returned. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to be talking now just about the human factors behind the disaster. So as I said, the Fukushima Daiichi incident was mainly a safety incident. But I think many of the insights of what went wrong are really applicable to nuclear security. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the role of communications. So the earthquake itself paralyzed telecommunication networks. It destroyed transport infrastructure. There was inadequate communication across all levels of the decision-making process, which ultimately undermined the response to the crisis. I mean, much of this, was kind of out of people's hands. It was a natural disaster. However, I think part of the problem that it was the magnitude of the disaster had never really been explored, and as a result, there weren't communication contingencies in place to manage that. This was really, really critical in the first few days of the disaster. There was also like a lack of up-to-date information, and this was not initially. This was when TEPCO were managing the crisis, but also when the Prime Minister's office stepped in to help manage a crisis, they were also relying on this outdated information. And I think what this really underlines is that communication is not just about information sharing, but it's also about clear reporting structures and recognized lines of command. And communication is absolutely critical in a disaster because it helps build resilience within organizations and helps them respond to crises. And although, like I said, the actual disaster was unprecedented, the communications had not been built into their kind of crisis contingency planning. So some of these problems could have been averted. Next slide, please. And the second important human factor behind the disaster was the leadership aspect. This kind of overlaps a lot with leadership. But basically, one of the main things was just there was confusion about who was leading the crisis management efforts. There was a lot of tensions between the stakeholders in the crisis, and then the importance of leadership in a crisis. It actually is really it's actually really interesting how it can undermine response. It can undermine because people don't understand what's going on, but they also don't know how to respond. There's a breakdown in the command chain. Poor decision making is made. Poor decisions are validated. So there's some other fundamental issues which relate to the IEA's nuclear security culture pyramid. So firstly, the lack of acceptance that a credible threat exists. So this is really critical for Fukushima, the belief that a low probability, high consequence event could occur. This led to the DVT assumptions and the seawall not being enlarged, for instance. Weak principles for guiding behaviour such as professionalism, responsibility, learning and improvement. And then lastly, poor leadership and management systems at the government, plant and a regulator level. So all of these are really, really important in any crisis and can be, and not just for a safety incident, but also for a security incident. Next slide, please. Okay, and my third point that I wanted to make about the human factors in the Fukushima disaster is this issue of regulatory capture, which to some extent exists, in many other countries in the world. But I think at the time in Japan, it was particularly evident. And there were actually 4 official investigations into the Fukushima disaster. One of those was led by the Parliament, the National Diet. And I've just got some extracts at the bottom of the page, which were very, this investigation was actually very, very critical. And it just outlined that this was a, fundamentally the crisis could have been averted. It actually was very explicit in blaming collusion between the regulator, the power company TAPCO and the government. So this was quite a wake-up call really for the nuclear industry, not just in Japan but abroad, and the danger of regulatory capture. So the regulatory capture refers to when there's a conflict of interest in the nuclear industry in a country, and often that can occur because the nuclear sector is a very specialized profession. So you often have people working for the regulator and then going to work for the companies. There might only be a few companies in the country, and then back to the regulator. So there's a very small group of people with these specialized skills, and that can lead to a lack of independence and lack of professionalism. Okay, the last slide then, thank you, Hannah. So the nuclear disaster at Fukushima was a really unprecedented event, and it's created a huge legacy. Firstly in Japan, with all the nuclear safety changes that have taken place, but also in terms of recognition of nuclear security. There had been an advisory committee on nuclear security established prior to the incident, but after the disaster, they produced quite a extensive report which looked at like how nuclear security could be improved. It was the first test case for Japan's response to a potential chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear attack. So although obviously this wasn't an attack, but it did question how Japan would manage a multi-agency response in this kind of potential scenario. And some of the broader impacts of the disaster was recognizing that although you might have a incident caused by natural causes, but human factors can often be the reason why the events can spiral out of control. Internationally, there was more recognition of the interlinkages between nuclear safety and nuclear security. There was more of an understanding of, in a crisis, how your requirements for nuclear safety and nuclear security may even come into conflict, especially on like at the site level, like who is coming and going at site. And then really quite importantly, recognition of how dangerous regulatory capture can be to how organizations and a whole industry respond to an event. And then the interlinkages between nuclear safety and nuclear security was something that was very explicitly recognized at the 2012 Nuclear Security Summit at Seoul. So I just want to conclude by saying, yeah, there was some really, really important lessons learned from the incident, but I think really most importantly that we learn from those lessons learned. So it's not just about you know, analysing what's happened and moving on, but actually I think we just have to keep these events are absolutely, you know, terrible for society, terrible for the industry, and it's really, really important that all the learnings are disseminated globally, and then hopefully these kind of things won't occur in the future. Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass you over to Geoffrey now.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And again, do feel free to drop questions for Sarah in the Q&A. And Geoff, over to you, who's going to speak about Belgium.
Sure. Hi, thank you. As introduced, I'm Geoffrey Chapman, and I'll be covering the Belgian nuclear security crisis of 2016. Next slide, please. The first thing to question about this crisis is whether it was indeed a nuclear security crisis at all. On the 13th of November in 2015, Islamic State supporters conducted the Paris attacks, leaving 130 dead. 2 weeks later, the Belgian authorities raided a Brussels apartment connected with a suspect and uncovered 10 hours worth of surveillance footage of a Belgian nuclear scientist. This raised fears that there may have been an Islamist plot against a nuclear facility in Belgium that was being planned. This sense of crisis was furthered in February 2016 when the existence of this footage became public knowledge. The security crisis peaked for Belgium with the 22nd of March 2016 Brussels bombings. Fears that an attack on a nuclear site were imminent were further fueled by reporting that in retrospect sometimes proved inaccurate and exaggerated the sense of vulnerability. Nonetheless, concerns over Belgian nuclear security were widely expressed in the media and were voiced in a motion to the EU Parliament. However, as there was no concrete evidence for a nuclear terrorist plot beyond the initial discovery of surveillance footage in 2016, this raises the question: was there a crisis for Belgian nuclear security at all? What I've tried to demonstrate in my case study is whether there was a real crisis or not doesn't matter. There was the perception of one. To alleviate the sense of a crisis, Belgian authorities had to make rapid efforts to implement reforms and reassure the public and international community at large. This case also highlights how previous nuclear security performance will dictate how nuclear security will be judged in the event of a crisis, perceived or otherwise. Next slide, please. In terms of tracing the root of a perception of weak Belgian civil nuclear security, this stems back to US concerns in the immediate post-9/11 environment. US officials under the Bush administration were keen for Belgium to improve its nuclear security, given its large stockpiles of highly enriched uranium. One key area of tension was over the stationing of armed guards at Belgian nuclear facilities, as, until relatively recently, only unarmed civilian guards were present on site. Change in this area was resisted by the Belgians, who believed that having military forces nearby to nuclear sites, in addition to a quick reaction police force, would be sufficient in case of an incident. This related to the politics of nuclear power in Belgium, where the stationing of armed guards on site was felt that it could highlight the inherent security risks of nuclear power. Even as Belgian nuclear security was progressively improved from 2001 onwards, the Dole 4 sabotage incident in 2014 seemed to highlight the worst fears over Belgian nuclear security. An as of yet unidentified insider was able to bypass the relatively rudimentary security measures in place in order to drain 65,000 litres of lubrication oil from a turbine, causing multi-million euros worth of damage and considerable disruptions to operations at the Dole site. The fact that the insider has still not been identified highlights the flaws of Belgian nuclear security processes and systems in operation at that time. In the aftermath, further security measures were implemented, including extensions of the areas covered by the two-persons rule and the installation of further surveillance systems. General security fears in Belgium were further heightened by an increased threat of domestic radicalization. Non-intrusive policing policies had allowed for extremist organizations to operate relatively unhindered. This included a group called Sharia for Belgium, which actively recruited members within the country between 2010 and 2012. These activities meant that by 2016, Belgium had the highest per capita rate of nationals acting as Islamic State fighters compared to any other European country. This included one fighter who had formerly been a contracted weld inspector on a Belgian nuclear site. Next slide, please. Belgium responded proactively to this heightened security situation. The national threat level was increased to its second highest threat level in 2015 in response to Islamic State activity, and to its highest level in 2016 following the Brussels bombings. The discovery of the surveillance footage of a nuclear scientist in 2015 appears to have finally prompted Belgian authorities to approve stationing of armed guards at civil nuclear sites. Military forces were deployed to Belgian nuclear sites 4 days prior to the Brussels bombings. In the immediate aftermath of the bombings, further security measures were implemented at Belgian nuclear sites. These included how all non-essential staff were sent home while the highest threat level remained in place. Increased checks were made on vehicles entering nuclear sites, and the two-person rule was extended to even more areas within nuclear facilities. A number of security clearances already under review were also immediately revoked in the aftermath of the attacks. Twinned with these efforts to remedy security concerns, a concerted attempt was made to reassure both the international community and public. Efforts to reassure were made by officials from operators, regulators, and various judicial and ministerial officials within Belgium. Efforts continue amongst the international community, including an outreach effort at the 2016 Nuclear Security Summit that was held 2 weeks after the Brussels bombings, where Belgium made further commitments to improving its nuclear security, and this message would be repeated again throughout 2016. Next slide, please. It is clear that the perceived nuclear security crisis of 2015 and 2016 spurred the implementation of security measures that had previously been resisted, most notably with the introduction of armed on-site guards. This was initially achieved with military personnel, but this was a temporary measure as they were restricted to only sensitive areas of nuclear sites, were frequently rotated and therefore lacked site knowledge, and they also had issues liaising with the unarmed civilian guard force. The creation of a civilian armed guard force took time, and this new force only became partially operational in September 2018. The Belgian nuclear regulator also took a partially prescriptive approach to implementing security improvements in the wake of Brussels bombings to ensure uniformity, and this led to the introduction of suboptimal measures that were sometimes less secure and more expensive than possible alternatives. Further work has been undertaken by Belgian authorities for risk reduction to the present, including, as of last year, starting the transition of using low-enriched uranium for medical isotope production. Next slide, please. In terms of lessons from this case, I think it highlights how formally perceived nuclear security can reinforce a sense of crisis when there is an elevated threat. Overcoming this sense of crisis for nuclear security can be achieved, but this requires a proactive approach from a range of institutions and officials to reassure the public and international community. This case also highlights how a security crisis can be used to overcome barriers to nuclear security reform, but the initial urgency in the wake of a crisis can mean that some of the measures will need readjustment over time. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it on.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jeff. And now finally, we're going to go to Amelie, who's going to talk about nuclear security in early post-Soviet Russia. Amelie, over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and hello from me as well. It's a pleasure to be here. And I will talk about the case study that Chris and I did on post-Soviet Russia and how the collapse of the Soviet Union has impacted nuclear security. Next slide, please. I'm going to quickly introduce to you Russia's nuclear sector in the 1990s and major changes that happened during and immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I will talk about attempts to mitigate new emerging risks. And this case study will show that security culture and perceptions of security and threat have to adjust to a changing political and economic situation within a country, but also that changing security concepts is a long and difficult process. Next slide, please. So Russia's nuclear sector in the 1990s was quite extensive because it had inherited a majority of the Soviet Union's facilities and also stockpiles. So the arsenal contained large stocks of highly enriched uranium, low enriched uranium and plutonium, warheads and nuclear powered ships, as well as 25 operating nuclear power reactors, which you can see on the maps. And most of them were located in remote closed cities where approximately 2 million people worked and lived. Next slide, please. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also shortly before, the political and economic situation in Russia deteriorated quickly, which also impacted, of course, the nuclear sector. So for nearly a decade, the formerly tight grip of the government gave way to a political quasi-vacuum, in which law enforcement became increasingly selective and mafia groups infiltrated virtually all major businesses, leading to then President Yeltsin's famous declaration that Russia is, quote, the biggest mafia state in the world. And this was only possible because the economy plunged, making it difficult for the state to pay for security infrastructure or personnel. And this also meant that Minatom, which was Russia's newly established nuclear facility regulatory body, was severely underfunded and therefore unable to provide nuclear facilities with adequate financial means. So nuclear facility management basically had to secure funding on their own to large parts, which is why many employees experienced reduced or often by months delayed payments and also mass layoffs. In addition to that, the existing hyperinflation made savings nearly worthless. Within only 1 year, the prices rose by 2,500% in the 90s. So nuclear personnel, which had before the crisis been paid well and held in high regards by the government, had to now take second or third jobs to be able to afford food, and they lacked basic equipment such as winter coats. And this meant that security personnel would not go outside to secure the perimeters or respond to alarms. They would have to switch off electricity on weekends, even off security systems, to save money, and they would abandon their posts to see if they could find food on the streets. So the results of the political vacuum and the severe recession for the nuclear sector were that the government exercised much less control than before, because its agency was crippled and financial duress was placed on both facility management and also employees, including the security personnel, giving way to a lot of problems. And investing in security hardware became increasingly difficult as well. And these factors, together with the growing black market, gave incentives to smuggle nuclear and radiological material out of these facilities or to seek employment elsewhere. So by the mid-90s, 36 nuclear scientists tried to migrate to the DPRK, and approximately 1,000 successfully migrated to China and another 200 to Iran. But these numbers can only be estimates because immigration control was quite loose at the time. And Russia recorded also 700 attempts to steal sensitive material, all of which involved insiders from nuclear facilities. This was a problem because there was a lot of demand on the black market, also by terrorist groups. For example, the Aum cult, which later perpetrated the sarin attacks in the Tokyo subway in 1995, had voiced interest in nuclear materials. And also Chechen rebels with connections to Al-Qaeda. And there are allegations that Al-Qaeda has actually successfully bought nuclear material from Russia, but they are not confirmed. Next slide, please. Of course, this growing risk did not remain unnoticed. Many Western countries, and especially the United States, created support initiatives, which aimed at providing equipment such as heaters, winter coats, and food, and modernizing security infrastructure. It also included training programs to teach nuclear facility workers how to handle the provided equipment and security systems. So, for example, scientists from Los Alamos in the US introduced workers at Russian nuclear facilities to computer-based nuclear material accounting, because before that, that was based on paper and it was manipulated regularly to fulfill state quotas. So, for example, low-enriched uranium was declared, although they were actually handling high-enriched uranium. But these initiatives faced various challenges. For example, the size of the Russian nuclear industry, as outlined before, was simply huge. After more than a decade of US subsidized security updates, the DOE estimated that less than a third of Russia's nuclear material was secured appropriately. In addition to that, the legal framework in the Soviet Union was very complex and multi-layered, and it was difficult to enforce. So changing this legal framework actually took a lot of time. In addition to that came issues that are mainly related to the fact that it might be relatively easy to replace outdated fences and install new sensors, but it's very difficult to change the security culture prevailing in the nuclear sector. So in Russia, there was a general skepticism regarding the utility of American equipment, and the work routines did not fit very well with this new equipment. So Russia's new security culture was focused mainly on espionage and outsider threats, not so much on insiders. And this is why it was difficult to convince the security personnel that they would now have to control who was coming out of the facilities and scan for material. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the workers were trusted rather than controlled when it came to theft. And changing this perception proved quite difficult. In the Soviet Union, security culture was mainly based on authority and obedience, which meant that commands were given from above and they had to be unquestionably followed. But the new security system had to be based on an awareness of independent responsibility, where workers were responsible for contributing to the security of that particular facility and could not rely on others to do that job. So previously, the security personnel were the only ones responsible for security. And now this was supposed to be a concern of every single employee. Changing this mindset was, again, very difficult. And also in the Soviet Union, when accidents happened, scapegoating used to be a common reaction. So instead of maintaining a database to gather information on accidents and to find underlying reasons, so for example, technological deficiencies, the failure was usually attributed to individuals and they were then held responsible. And that always left the impression that the problem was solved, but the underlying conditions that had originally led to that problem remained. And again, changing this mindset was very difficult. Next slide, please. Three major things can be drawn from the Russian case study. So first of all, when major changes in a political and/or economic system of a state occur, it's likely that the security has to respond to these changes and be adapted in order to respond to new pressures. And second, when we change security concepts, it's important to develop a holistic and integrated approach. And this means that it will not be enough to look at security from a purely materialistic point of view and provide respective security equipment. But one also has to look at legal, regulatory, and operation aspects that shape the security system one wants to change. And even that is not enough, because if what creates the crisis is not changed, the risks will remain high. And lastly, the human factor, so the motivation of security personnel and other employees, plays a major role in nuclear security. and that's why they should not be neglected when changing or adapting security systems. But changing perceptions of threat and responsibility is not a quick fix. It takes a lot of time. And it should also be noticed that in the Soviet Union, simply bringing a new culture in was impossible. One has to basically work with what is already there and slowly change or supplement it rather than trying to bring something entirely new just because it worked somewhere else. So thank you very much. That's it from me.
Okay, thanks very much, Amelie, and all the speakers. We've got about, I think, 7 minutes or so for questions, so do feel free to pop those in the Q&A box. I think I will kick off with a question for all speakers. So one of the motivations, obviously, behind this study was the COVID-19 pandemic and how that has disrupted nuclear operations, implementation of nuclear security. So a question for all of you, anyone that wants to jump in and answer, is what are some of the key findings from your particular case that you think is particularly pertinent or relevant to the situation we're currently in now with the COVID-19 pandemic? And what are the lessons we can learn? And I can see Nick has already got his hand up because we've also been doing some sort of parallel work on this track. So Nick, why don't you take it first and then we can pass to others.
So I think there are a lot of lessons, but I'd like to talk about just one that sort of generally applies to not only my case, but I think all the other cases as well. And also we've seen some of examples of this in response to COVID-19 also. But talking about these case studies and talking about how nuclear facilities have responded to security incidents, that information sharing process is something that doesn't happen enough in the nuclear security world and is particularly important when we're talking about crises. And what's been interesting about COVID-19 is we've already seen some examples where, for example, the IAEA has conducted surveys of member states and asked about concerns and responses to COVID-19. But I think the more we can talk about lessons learned from security incidents, really crisis or not, the better prepared we are for events like this.
So for the case of Fukushima Daiichi, I think there's two quite interesting kind of lessons learned that relate to the COVID-19 pandemic. One is is sort of securing personnel on site, knowing the movements of different personnel, especially during crisis. You're likely to have different groups of people entering the site. You might have contractors, you might have military personnel, you might have emergency workers. And one of the problems in the Fukushima Daiichi disaster was that there wasn't always really clear who'd been on site, and what that meant was that some of those people. So from a security point of view, it's obvious that this was a vulnerability, but actually what it meant was those people weren't able to be monitored. So then further on, their health that had been exposed to radiation wasn't able to be monitored. So that was really really important, and I think that does relate to the pandemic, because the personnel that actually is probably one of the key sort of vulnerabilities at the moment, because you need to know where everybody is. Many people are working from home now. So in nuclear power plants all across the world, there's different arrangements in place. Many people are working from home, and you have to understand, what those implications are for security, from the cyber point of view, but also for whether a maintenance checks can be conducted, etc. That's the first point. And the second point is, I think the pandemic is quite an interesting one because there's been clearly different phases in it. So you had the kind of initial sort of early phase in spring of last year. People there was quite a lot of unknowns at the time. And I think that's really important in a crisis, because when a crisis arrives, often it is an unprecedented event. Particularly in the Fukushima Daiichi case, it was unprecedented. It kind of went beyond the kind of existing assumptions, and so that you have that kind of initial crisis phase, but then you might find that the crisis continues and it continues longer. So, in the case of pandemic, I think it's kind of it's gone on for longer than many people envisaged. And you sort of get used to that kind of living in that almost crisis environment, although technically it wouldn't be considered a crisis a year on. But with Fukushima Daiichi, again, it's very, very long term, and the decommissioning phase is going to last years and years. So I think it's kind of being able to differentiate between different phases and what that means for security and safety, and the planning and the assumptions that you make will be changing all the time. So having kind of agility and being able to adapt to those different phases, I think is really important. So a crisis isn't just one event, and you have a sort of certain set of principles and policies in place, but actually you need to be able to adapt that and evolve as sort of usually the crisis kind of lessens off over time.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Jeff, Amelie, anything to add?
Yep, 2 quick points. I think it's a point that we've raised in pretty much all of our case studies, but proactive communication, hopefully planning has gone into security during COVID, but how security is being implemented during this crisis needs to be proactively communicated to build up that resilience to avoid a sense of crisis if anything were to happen. And something that does particularly rise from my case study, can the different situation arising from COVID be turned into an opportunity? Is the less people on site, does that give opportunities to reassess security, install new systems? It will depend on the situation, but something to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I think that also from the Russian case study, it became pretty obvious that security culture also has a lot to do with the perception of responsibility from the respective workers. And there needs to be this sense of responsibility, even in times of crisis, to maintain a certain level of security at the facilities. And that needs to be reinforced so that in times of crisis, these workers still feel this responsibility and the need to go to work and do the work appropriately.
Great, thanks very much, everyone. I note we're sort of almost out of time right now, so I think I'll just wrap up by thanking all of our panelists and just sort of reiterating that the detailed case studies should be available soon in the next 2 or 3 weeks in the volume that's being produced on these, accessible via the CSSS website. I also just want to flag that we are doing some parallel research looking specifically at the impact of COVID-19 on nuclear security, both internationally and also from looking at the UK in more detail. So again, we'll have some outputs on that, hopefully available in the next couple of months. And then finally, I just want to flag that the next seminar as part of the UK's nuclear security program, which will be on nuclear forensics, delivered by David Smith, former forensics lead at the International Atomic Energy Agency, will be on March the 25th. So look out for an invitation to that as well. Recording all this will be available on our YouTube site. And thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Hope to see you all again soon. So bye everyone.